we're just waiting so Dr. Who enable the sharing. We cannot
I think
hear
her
you.
microphone is mute. She wants to say something.
Okay.
Yes, I has already clicked that.
Okay.
Okay.
It says disabled. Host
And
disabled
still,
sharing. You
can you share now?
Yes, now we can. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you
Sorry.
very
Thank you.
much. You can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So
Yes.
I will start. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Today I will share with you a reflection about violence in Latin American societies through a science and technology studies notion, co-production between technoscience and society. I will argue that the notion of co-production between technoscience and society can function as a study tool to detect violence in the technoscientific projects developed in Latin American societies. To develop this argument, I will first mention what I mean by the notion of co-production and what is technoscience. Subsequently, I will give some examples of technoscientific projects in Mexico and Colombia and the violence they cause in their respective societies. Finally, I will present some conclusions on the relevance of this approach. So first, what is co-production? Co-production is a notion developed by science, technology, and society studies to account for the symmetrical relationship between the work of science and society, in such a way that the impact of science on society and vice versa can be made visible. That is, one produces the other and vice versa. Just as there can be co-production between science and technology, science and society, there can be also co-production between technoscience and society. So the main idea of co-production is symmetrical relationship between the work of science and society. But we can also think co-production in terms of the relationship between technoscience and society. So what is technoscience? Technoscience emerged in the mid-20th century as a new social mode of technological practices. It fuses scientific knowledge and technological production, whose main purpose is the development and innovation of technical objects, and not only the search for knowledge as the academic science does. The philosopher Javier Echeverría distinguishes technoscience from science and technology, not as a demarcation proposal, but as a way of delimiting the characteristics of each one. For example, technology is no longer considered as applied science. It incorporates scientific knowledge. A technological activity can be identified as one in which the primary objective is pragmatic productive and the secondary or subordinate objective is theoretical. Also, the scientific activity, its main purpose is theoretical and epistemic, mostly explanatory. It is interested in the development of theoretical models. The difference between technology and scientific activity is the difference between technology, scientific activity, and technoscience is technoscience. It seeks true and useful knowledge, scientifically justified, although its main characteristics are principally the values. For example, in technoscience, the values are technical values like usefulness, efficiency, efficacy, functionality, applicability, etc. Capitalist values, it means economical values, for example, rapid enrichment as part of objectives of technoscientific companies. So the motivations of companies dedicated to research and development are no longer the generation of knowledge, but technological innovation and its capitalization in the market. This focus on innovation and commoditizations led technoscientific companies to become interested in other relevant values to continue with their production schemes and to obtain, manage, and profit from patents, such as cultural, ecological, and social values. In turn, this approach to knowledge production opened a new economic sector with multiple modalities of exploitation and profitability of knowledge ownership, such as licenses, franchises, access, and connection subscriptions. Other characteristic of technoscience is that the private sector is important for the development of technoscience. This led to the emergence of science and technology policy, promotes, develops, and transforms the context in which scientists go to research and technologies to innovate. And the last one is the articulation of research networks. In the traditional practice of modern science, the laboratory is the place par excellence where knowledge is produced. With the emergence of technoscience and the implementation of information and communication technologies in laboratories, coordinated laboratories emerge. In them and through them, there is a redistribution and division of tasks. In other words, they are sort of network laboratories. And the last value, which is important to think technoscience, is military values. After World War I, scientists became involved in military practices and projects. These values give rise to a series of considerations regarding technoscience. First, technoscientific research, whether large or small, acquired a strategic relevance for the military powers. The partial militarization of technoscience, the second characteristic of military values, part of the scientific knowledge and technological innovation become confidential and secret, breaking one of the basic values of modern science, the publicity of knowledge. This does not imply that everything is secret. The third one, that the products of technoscience are subordinated to military projects, eradicates the possibility of free discussion and criticism of the hypotheses at stake. The fourth characteristic, to recognize that technoscience can be destructive, not only creative. Destructive technoscience is an indispensable part of the new scientific activity, so it is difficult to continue affirming that knowledge is a good in itself, as many scientists are accustomed to say. Technoscience challenges the idea of pure science, and it is a practice that accounts for other values involved in the creation and development of science and technology. So we have the definition of co-production and technoscience. So we can think about co-production between technoscience and society. I will share with you two examples of co-production between technoscience and society. The first one is in Mexico, Tren Maya, Mayan Train Project. The Mayan Train Project is a project to improve people's quality of life, care for the environment, and detonate sustainable development. It will cover approximately 1,500 kilometers and will pass through the states of Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo. Well, the technoscientific values in this project are economic, social, ecological, cultural, political, and technical. The discourse around this project says that this train will give prosperity for the south of Mexico, employment, and economic development through technoscience. This project is of the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So this project has name and last name. The violences this project has developed in this region of Mexico are land dispossession, especially of indigenous people, drug and human trafficking, and deforestation. This supposes the violation of human rights, discrimination, and inequality. So the notion of co-production between a technoscience and society can help us to identify this kind of a violation of human rights and other violences that are in this region, thinking about technoscience and society as symmetrical relationships. So the second example is in Colombia, mina de carbón El Cerrojón coal mine. El Cerrojón is a coal deposit located in the department of La Guajira. It is located in the Rancheria River Basin and is one of the largest open pit mines in the world with approximately 69,000 hectares. Initially, in state hands, El Cerrejón produced coal for electricity generation in other regions of the world. Today, the mine is in the hands of transnational mining companies, including BHP, Anglo-American, and Glencore. Decades of operation of the mine led to dispossession of the original Guajira inhabitants from their lands. So the technoscientific values in this project are economic, technical, social, and political. This project has developed a lot of violence in this region, like forced displacement of Wayu and Afro-Colombian indigenous communities in the region. Another affected communities are Tabaco community, provincial community, and Nuevo Espinal community. Ecological problems like diversion of water source, labor and trade union problems, rights violated like right to property, to health, to personal safety and integrity, to life, to a healthy environment, also harassment, aggression, threats, blockades, obstructions, etc. So to end this brief exposition, I would like to conclude with these main ideas. Through the notion of co-production between technoscience and society, we can account for violence through the axiological evaluation of technoscience. That is, to evaluate which values are involved in the development and promotion of technoscientific projects. For example, whether there are cultural, ecological, military, technical, economic, etc. Technoscience is not just a practice or analysis category, but an agent of changes. We can use it for bad or good things because it is a human product, so we are responsible for its causes and effects. There's no technoscience without society, and society is constantly transformed by technoscience products, practices, and effects. The notion of co-production between technoscience and society focuses on problems that would not be seen in this way from other categories of study, especially because technoscience accounts for other values, such as military, economic, political, and cultural values in the work of science and technology. However, I do not intend to argue that it's a category with epistemic privilege, but that it can be added to others that allow us to account for problems in our societies, especially to account for violence and conflicts related to developments in science and technology, and their possible alternatives. It should not be forgotten that technoscience can be also creative, not only destructive. So that's all. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Astrid. So now we are going with Gemma. We are going to see another kind of violence also promoted by the state, but we are going on a more historical perspective. So I will once again send you in the chat the resume of Gemma. Gemma is an historian and sociologist. She specialized on question of violence, crime, religion, and gender. So I don't know why I cannot send it in the chat. So while I resume that, so she specialized especially on Mexico and Central America, and she is now an assistant professor of Latin America history at George W. University, and she will present a polemic discussion, the monopoly that never was, extra-legal violence and state formation in 20th and 21st century Mexico. Thank you so much, Gemma, for accompanying us.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna try to share my screen as well. Okay. Sorry, it seems that I don't have. Give me a second. I think I need to allow Zoom to access my screen. Wow, I don't know if I can do that now. Could I send it to you very quickly by email?
Yes, I share it if you want.
Yes, sorry, because I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll do that. Give me a second. And I can start while you are able to receive it. apologize for this. I'm not sure why it's not configured.
Don't worry if you want to start, and then I will.
Yeah.
I will share once I receive it.
Okay. Sure. Let me just. I just want to send it to you. Okay, it's uploading. So thank you again for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts about violence in Mexico. And as Yves mentioned, I'm a sociologist and a historian. So I am, as many historians, I guess, I study things that I care about that are taking place in Latin America today. So one of the motivations for me to write and research on violence has to do with the continuous pervasive effects and impacts that violence has on the lives of Latin American citizens. And so some of the thoughts that I'm going to share with you today are partially based on the book that I published a couple of years ago, and that is being translated to Spanish, which is called In the Vortex of Violence: Lynching, Extralegal Justice, and the State in Post-Revolutionary Mexico. So I study extralegal violence and violence more broadly, and its relation to the state through the lenses of lynching, which, as many of you I'm sure know, I mean, from the context of Latin America, where lynchings continue to happen in several Latin American countries, including Mexico, Guatemala, Bolivia, Ecuador, but also other countries like Brazil and Argentina. It's an extralegal, public, particularly cruel form of collective violence, which aim is to punish individuals considered threatening or offensive. You might know also the phenomenon of lynching from other scenarios. This is, of course, not something that is exclusive to Latin America. The United States had a long history of lynchings for the second half of the 19th century, particularly, and up to the 1930s. But Latin America is peculiar in the sense that it, again, continues to happen, and some of the cases that have received most attention from a scholar, but also from the press, are located in Mexico, Guatemala, Bolivia. So what is the main, so I should just say, like, the book is based or draws evidence from the post-revolutionary period, specifically from 1930 up to 1960. And this was a period that was foundational for the process of state building in Mexico. It was a period that involved systematic efforts on behalf of the political elites in order to centralize and modernize the countryside, both through infrastructure projects, and this sort of connects to the first presentation, infrastructure projects, modernization projects, the building of bridges, roads, but also sanitation programs, vaccination campaigns, programs to prohibit the consumption of alcohol, and also education programs, education and cultural projects. And these taken together were fundamental for the process, for the project of state building envisioned by the post-revolutionary elites, and specifically by the elites that eventually were part of the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party that was in power in the country for most of the 20th century. In terms of violence, I mean, this period is peculiar, or was central, because it enabled allegedly a greater institutionalization of violence and the taming or the domestication of strongmen and other armed actors at the local level. I mean, so in the traditional narrative that has been, of course, challenged by several historians, and with which I am in dialogue, or my work is in dialogue with, the traditional narrative kind of claimed that this period was a period of pacification in the country, that the greater centralization of power, the greater modernization efforts promoted by the state, the lesser levels of violence. And there was some evidence to show this in terms of statistics of homicide. Homicides did decline at the national and aggregate level beginning in the 1940s. And this tendency really was only reversed in 2007, where the levels of homicide related to drug killings peaked in the country. So there was some evidence, statistical, and also if we reduce our understanding of violence to homicides, no? But I can talk about why it is problematic to understand violence only centering on homicides. Ibs, were you able to get the email or not?
No, I don't receive it yet.
Okay.
So
okay, sorry. Now it was asking me to grant permission to share.
I think you're able to share.
Yes, no, I am able to share, but unfortunately, I hadn't set up my. It seems that in my computer, I need to set some sort of permission for.
Okay.
But if you want, if by mail it's not working, you can upload it on the chat. On the Zoom chat.
Yes,
you can
sure.
send to us the file. Maybe I just received it.
Okay.
Wait. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
So,
go on. I will open it. Go on.
Okay, great. So some of the main arguments of the book, but especially for this presentation that I wanted to share with you, was that in the first one is that lynching and really extralegal violence more broadly, I would argue, does not express an absence of state authorities, but actually, as I hope I will show, it actually is the result of the presence of state authorities that are perceived as illegitimate or abusive. The other argument that I make in the book more broadly is that lynching escapes binary understandings of violence. It's not redemptive revolutionary violence from below, as has been sometimes theorized by certain social scientists working in Latin America, but it's not either an entirely or purely repressive violence that comes from top down. It has elements from both. It escapes this kind of top-down, bottom-up narratives of violence. Lynching certainly has to do with the state's incapacity to punish crimes and other transgressions, but it goes beyond impunity. And I would argue that people's propensity to embrace lynching and other extralegal forms of violence has also to do with the notion that there are certain crimes and certain transgressions that do not deserve to be punished through procedural means or through legal means, but that deserve to be punished through these corporeal, collective, and swift forms of justice or injustice, rather. And the last question is that lynching is not only about crime control. I mean, there is plenty of evidence from the past, but also from the present. Thank you. You can go back, Yves, and I'm gonna go very quickly with this. Here, perfect. That lynching is not only about crime control. I mean, lynching does not necessarily happen in areas that have greater levels of crime. But what matters are perceptions of crime. I mean, the people's perception that crime has increased, or that there are crimes that are threatening their collectivity or their sense of physical and material integrity. And also in the history of lynching that I examine, beyond crime, lynchings have been organized as a response to offenses that have to do with religion, with mythical beliefs, with political ideologies. In other words, there's a much more complex and richer causal drivers behind lynching. And then I guess like the kind of provocative title that I share with you has to do with this idea at the bottom of this slide, which is that there was never really a monopoly of violence in Mexico in the 20th century. But contrary to what traditional sociological theories would suggest based on Western experiences, this does not necessarily entail the failure of the state, but actually reflects the ways in which authority was built and negotiated in the country throughout the 20th century, and which I would argue continues to characterize the ways in which violence is administered in contemporary Mexico, which is in a way that is negotiated with other armed actors, including drug traffickers, self-defense forces, and lynch mobs. The next one. Thank you. So this is just a very brief, like I like to incorporate like cultural representations or cultural analysis in my work. So my work is based on the analysis of 366 cases of lynching that took place from 1930 to 1960, but also I analyze a variety of cultural artifacts, including film that represented lynchings. And so this is just a screenshot from the film McClean that was featured in 1948 by the very influential Mexican director Emilio El Indio Fernandez. And in these and several other movies of the period, the story or like one of the parts of the plot involve a lynching, no? And in this case, it is a lynching about against a couple, especially against the woman who has been accused of acting immorally. And what we see in this image that I'm presenting here is how the mortified couple that is about to be lynched by the mob, and you don't see the mob in this picture, but in the film, the mob is presented by indigenous rural villagers wearing big hats and running with like torches with fire. So it is indigenous, no? I mean, like, and I can you know, like express this or unpack more this idea of how lynching is racialized in Mexico to the extent that it's presented by the press and by other cultural artifacts as if it would be only related to indigenous communities, where actually empirical evidence shows that lynchings were happening and continue to happen in mestizo communities and also in the city. So what we see here is that the victims of lynching are being defended by a soldier, by Cabo Mendoza in this case, and we see the soldiers in the left side with their bayonets synchronized, you know, a very, you know, like expressive notion that the state embodies a violence that is order, that has to do with the law, and that has to be with civilization and modernity. Whereas the lynch mob allegedly represents, you know, disorder, uncivilized conduct. Next. And so I use this, you know, like I problematize these representations of the state violence as being civilized or as being necessarily opposed to the lynch mobs by showing several ways in which the state provokes or is behind the occurrence of many of these acts of violence, and also the blur lines between state violence and the lynch mob. So there are three modalities of lynching that I identify, and I won't go into details of all of them, but it's basically lynching as resistance, lynching as corrective justice, and lynching sanctioned by the state. The next. So lynching as resistance basically refers to a series of lynchings organized against the state intervention in matters that communities consider local. This had to do with education, religion, but also like sanitation, conscription, alcohol control, and land tenure. So in this case, this modernization and centralization efforts of the state provoked communities who regarded this intervention as abusive and arbitrary, and reacted to these centralization efforts. No? And who were the victims of these lynchings? Socialist teachers, medical doctors, soldiers, engineers in charge of building bridges or roads, tax collectors, and other public officials. Next. This is just an illustration of some of the victims of these lynchings, as I said, included rural teachers or teachers that came from came to rural areas in order to promote not only literacy campaigns, but also sanitation campaigns, and oftentimes also meddle in questions of land tenure, and importantly, also promoted secularization. So they face a lot of backlash from predominantly Catholic communities, but also some communities that simply did not want the state to interfere in the ways in which they distributed land or decided over other questions that had to do with health and education. And this is a picture of two teachers that were, the previous one was a picture of two female teachers whose ears were cut, mutilated by the lynch mob, and several teachers were hanged or had their ears mutilated, as in this example. The next one. This is a series of lithographs that is actually based on actual cases against socialist teachers, and again, kind of like just illustrating the level of brutality of many of these incidents that involve the burning of the body of the teachers or the use of machetes against one of these teachers that came to the rural communities. Next. This is another example. I won't go into details, but there was a campaign against the foot and mouth disease, and doctors, veterinary doctors, and military were also lynched as a retaliation from intervening in what was considered local affairs. Next. The second modality is this question of lynching as corrective justice, and these are basically in response to abuses committed by state actors or those who exercise de facto social control within given communities. No? And so these were cases that like perpetrated against police, military, but also like caciques or local strongmen and majors in retaliation for what people perceive as abuse of power. And in the book, I show the ways in which, again, extralegal violence was not only perpetrated by citizens, but also by state actors. And citizens were not simply passive victims of these abuses, but also responded to them through the use of violence. And that's why the book is called In the Vortex of Violence, because this is a violence that cuts on both ends and really doesn't end. Next. This is just an example of a newspaper clip that shows a policeman that was lynched by a mob because he had allegedly killed somebody. No? So it's called El Policía Asesino. The murderous police was about to be lynched by the multitude. Next. We can go to the next one. I feel that I'm running out of time. So the third and last modality are these lynchings sanctioned by the state. And this is the one that clearly and most manifestly shows how the state did not have a monopoly of violence, but also state actors were not promoting civilized conduct or the rule of law, but actually also abusing this power. So these are lynchings that were organized with the approval or with the direct participation of state authorities, including mayors and police officers. This won't be surprising for anyone that is familiar with the history of lynching in the United States that involved Texas Rangers and other police officers, but this is not something that is known in the case of Mexico. And the victims, again, included a range of individuals, including women accused of witchcraft, people that practice Protestant religions, among others. Next. And here just like some examples, like in the press, like how the press actually refers to these cases, even when the police are behind it, as lynching, no? Using the word linchamiento. Next. And this is also like a case from the several that I have analyzed of letters of complaint written by victims of by family members of the victims of lynching to the authorities, complaining about the participation of majors. And then finally, yes, this is good. So this is the ways in which I try to connect the past and the present. No, I mean, and I think this is not to say that there is like a linear story or that nothing has changed. Plenty has changed, and I can talked a little bit more about how the phenomenon of lynching has changed historically. However, I do see a lot of continuities. So lynching, as I said, continues to happen in Mexico today. There was a very famous case recently in June 10 of 2022. A 31-year-old lawyer was lynched in Puebla, in a town in Puebla. And let me just read like one of these excerpts from an article in El País in this Spanish newspaper, just to show you again that the state is not absent necessarily in these occurrences. So the second one says, the mob prevents the police from rescuing Daniel, the victim, and more patrol cars arrive as the minutes tick away. Dozens of state and local police from nearby Huachinango, as well as some military personnel, all descend on the town. Then the last one. The videos clearly show the flashing lights of all the police cars. Some say that the police challenge anyone who tried to help Picasso, the victim, asking, are you his accomplice? So this shows that the police is not absent, they are there, and they are incapable or unwilling to prevent the lynching. Next. So again, in many cases, past and present, the state or state authorities are there, but they are perceived as abusive, ineffective, and illegitimate, or they actually participate in these acts and condone the occurrence of these forms of extralegal violence. There is still a presence of forms of social control outside of the law at the local level in Mexico. There is a preference for corporeal, collective, and swift forms of punishment that I will be happy to discuss what this has to do with cultural and political factors. And state actors, they no longer participate overtly in lynchings, but they continue to participate in extra-legal forms of violence. No? And the case of Ayotzinapa, of the students, and the participation of military and police in that case clearly shows that, again, the state is not a civilizing force, but also that the state doesn't have the monopoly of violence at all, but that this is not a synonym of a state failure, but a history of how state building has happened in Mexico. Next, and I think that's it. Okay, thank you so much, and I apologize for all the technical difficulties. Thank you, Yves.
Thank you so much, Gemma. And now we are going to our last panelists. Yael, I've seen you have taken a lot of notes, so it will be interesting. So now we are going once again to Colombia with Dr. Manuel Faustino Cardoso Ruiz, who is a historian from the University of Santander and now professor at the Catholic University Este, Ingolstadt. I'm not sure I pronounce it well, but
yes, you did. You did your best.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, sorry because I have the same issue with some permissions in my computer to be able to see myself in the video, but I think we're gonna be okay. My presentation today is about transitional justice in Colombia from 2005 and 2016. This is a topic that has been, it's like the context of my research, which is specifically the struggle for truth. And one of these institutions, transitional institution, the Truth Commission that was created in 2016 by the peace agreement. But I would like to start first with some previous peace agreements between the government and guerrillas after more than 50 years of violence, of conflict in Colombia. During the 80s and 90s, the government and these guerrilla groups start to speak about peace agreements. And during the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, this first peace agreements were signed with many guerrilla groups, like 5 or 6, to mention just one is the M19, the M19, that is a very urban guerrilla group. And to mention another one is Quintín Lame, a very indigenous background group. But these agreements are not considered a transitional justice system because even though they refer to a transitional context, political context, they are not built to reparate and to search justice for the victim. They are more designed to regain the rule and the order in the country and to open wave of the democratization and political participation. And the main purpose of this intervention, the intervention today for me, is to explain the main characteristics of this transitional justice system implemented in Colombia since 2005 to 2016, presenting the main characteristics and also explain three particular moments of this transitional justice system that seems very fragmented. I'm gonna present it to explain some characteristics, critics, and maybe the main challenge that they face, and also some of the goals that they have at the moment. The first one is the 1975 Justice and Peace Law in 2005, and it was between the state and the paramilitaries, and it was a pact made under the government of Álvaro Uribe Vélez, and the narrative of the national policy to define the violence in Colombia. The narrative was that Colombia was suffering from an internal enemy, and all these groups with different ideologies, they were not conceived by the government as insurgents. They were just illegal armed groups, and in that sort of in this context was create this peace agreement. It was like a pact, very close and very private between the government and the paramilitaries. And it is the first time that in Colombian legislation recognized the right of the victims and society to the truth and the duty of memory of the state. And it includes this transitional system and Colombia legislation in international standards for the first time, even though this law was very controversial. And the law was considered by the victims and human rights organization as a very soft law, because the maximum sentence was 8 years in prison for crimes such as massacres and forced disappearance and war crimes. And a lot of the statements from human rights organizations said that the government used this transitional justice system to avoid international court crime intervention. And it creates 4 main transitional institutions, because every transitional system needs like a base of institution to be implemented in society and with the armed forces. And also it becomes a very controversial in terms of the sentences that international court has in some cases that put very close the state military forces and these illegal paramilitary groups. And then the second moment was in 2011, when this organization, victims organization and human rights, criticized and make a lobby to present to the Congress, the Colombian Congress, the second transitional justice system. Transitional justice system in Colombia, you have to keep in mind that law make this transitional, and sometimes I'm using the word law and transitional justice here as a synonymous because they are created by law, and some of them are decrees and some of them are acts approved by the Congress. In this case, this act was created by the Congress with a congressman called Luis Juan Fernando Cristo, and with the lobby of these human rights organizations, he presented to the Congress, and they approved it. It was the first transitional justice system that recognized that there is an armed conflict, and through this recognition, it becomes Colombia and its context of legislation in line with international standards, and also in line with Geneva treaties and the soft international law and transitional justice. And one of the main things that this law made is it was centered in the victim. The focus was the victim, and it creates and developed the concept of victim of armed conflict in Colombia as a category of recognition, and also established 1985 as a starting point of the victim recognition. It was a point in the same time this periodization was a very critic by the victims organization, other sector of human rights, because they asked themselves what happened with other victims before this and their families. Another criticism is the lack of efficiency in the implementation of the system, especially in the process of returning land, because one of the main goals of this law was to tackle the problem of land and land restitution by farmers and indigenous communities. And this process of land restitution was a very problematic due to the violence in the periphery and the local and regional levels. And it creates three main transitional institutions. These institutions also are, the target is to support the implementation of the system, and these institutions are the Special Administrative Unit for Attention and Integral Reparation of the Victims. The second one is a Special Administrative Unit for the Management of Land Restitution, and the third one, a National Historical Memory Center. This system creates the Victim Participation Board in the national level. That means group of victims that represent other victims in every municipality of the country. It is important to know that in terms of symbolic and collective reparation, the National Center of Historical Memory has published more than 19 reports of human rights violations. And this system has created a unique register of victims in the national level that allows the government to have control of some statistics to have as a reference and base for future transitional systems, transitional justice system. And the final part of this very fragmented transitional system is that one that was created by the Havana Peace Agreement between the FARC guerrilla and the government, by the head of Juan Manuel Santos as a president. In anticipation for the negotiation with the guerrillas, the government create this kind of a buffer, judicial buffer, to transform the constitution, the 1997 constitution, and transform the constitution, adding some articles to the constitution that allow the judicial transitional system to be put in place without any hesitation from behalf of the Congress. And this were the constitutionalization of the transitional justice system in Colombia to build a strong and very well protected transitional justice system. And the creation of this transitional justice create a very integral system of trust, justice, and reparation that seems to articulate in some parts the previous transitional justice system create. And even though it's still fragmented, there are some type of reference to some procedures, judicial procedures, that are related with the previous transitional system, with the second one overall. It creates three main three main transitional institutions: judicial, and not judicial, and humanitarian. The judicial is a special jurisdiction for peace that is in charge of the sentenced open cases and make the investigation of the crimes. And there is a non-judicial that is a truth commission that is in charge of construct and publish a final report explaining what happened and why this happened to the victims, and to explain the society why this conflict happened. And also the third is humanitarian institution that is a unit to research for disappearance people in the context of the conflict. And more or less, this institution have within 20 and 15 and 20 years, except for the Truth Commission that just have 3 years, and due to the COVID pandemic, was extend this period for 3.5 years. And this institution, this jurisdiction, opened 7 macro cases regarding human rights violation and international crimes, and that prioritized territorial situation, and also the recruitment of girls and boys in an armed conflict, and among other cases. It was also very controversial because the government put in place a plebiscite to approve this peace agreement, but as a surprise for everyone, the no was the winner of this plebiscite. And there were some kind of rumors of manipulation through mass media, to digital strategy, to micro-targeting some publics with different information and misinformation, that as a result, the no was the winner. But it creates a very controversial environment afterward. There was a meeting between the leaders of the no initiative, and they agree, closed doors with some reforms, and they finally put the peace agreement in place, and the constitution changed. And open these macro cases, and also is very important the true recovery process, that the final report is a very complex report, and is a very very huge, more than 11 volumes of information of human rights violations, and also visibilize another type of violence in the country, not just the elimination, physical elimination of the enemy, but also gender violence and ethnic and communities that were being victims just for being so, and being in the territory where the conflict was happening. And as a sentence to conclude, it's very important to say the transitional justice system in Colombia is a fragmented system, and is parallel to an ordinary justice system. I mean, every institution is independent from and very distant from the ordinary judicial and very domestic judicial system in Colombia. And it has been used by the Colombian political elites to execute their own agendas and policies of peace and war, as a phenomenon that limits the impact of any peace-building measures. Also, this transitional justice system in Colombia has gone from being centered of those responsible for crimes, with a maximalist criterion of wanting, or better said, pretending to judge all those involved, to a restorative type of transitional justice system centers on the victims, with different criteria, with a prioritization and selection of macro cases that will allow the judge to judge the responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is all from my side, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So now I will introduce Dr. Yahel Siman. She's an associate professor in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Iberoamericana. She has different interests of research, first connecting Holocaust and Latin America, anti-Semitism and discourses of hatred in Latin America. And now she is also working on a research project on the mobilization of victims of relative forced disappearance in Mexico. And also she has worked a lot with colleagues from Chile and Colombia. So thank you so much, Dr. Seaman, for being with us and sharing your comments and questions. I'm sure you will have a lot to share with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yves, and thank you, everybody. Well, first of all, the three presentations were fascinating and I learned a lot. It's quite challenging to offer comments since I didn't get them beforehand and I have to process everything that I just heard, but I'll try. So first, I thought it would be, I think, nice to ask the presenters a few questions to maybe go deeper into their thoughts and research. So for Astrid, and because this is really new for me, I admit it. So I wanted to ask you if the co-production between society and techno-science, whether it's really symmetrical or whether the cases that you showed actually showed prove the opposite, that the relationship is not symmetrical, and that's why violence is a resulting outcome. So that, for example, I don't know so much the case of Colombia, but in the case of Mexico, the Tren Maya doesn't really include every perspective of society, every actor that is affected by this development and touristic and ecological, so forth and so on project. And that's why there is conflict and there is violence. So it's more the asymmetrical characteristic rather than its symmetry. So I wanted to ask you that. I will share everything and then maybe the presenters can respond. Then I also think that it's important and to point out the gaps between the state discourse and reality. So that's something that it was there in your presentation, but I wonder if you can talk more about that. And what values are really driving these projects, and the one in Mexico that I know best specifically. Then for Gemma, or Gemma, I don't know how you pronounce your name, Gemma.
Gemma.
Gemma, okay. Well, it's fascinating. I have to say, Yves said that my research is kind of disconnected, but it's not. And your presentation made me think of the mob violence in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. So I don't think they are disconnected. I think there are plenty of connections. And regarding that, I wanted to ask you whether there was, in the lynchings that you studied, over 300 cases, whether there was like a ritual before the actual lynching, because that happens a lot in these kinds of local violence. I also, you actually led me to think a lot about how we need to problematize the distinctions between perpetrators, victims, spectators, collaborators, and try to do more research about that specifically in Mexico. I think there's not enough. And what kind of values and affections also run along these networks of complicity, collaboration, or even solidarity, if we think of peace building as well. And also, I think that you bring to the fore multiple actors that may have been invisible, and you also challenge this notion of the state being absent or not, or being present. And I was gonna ask you, you made me think about the following, whether the state was really present because it was overseeing the violence, or whether it's because of its lack of control and therefore its absence in real concrete ways that this local violence takes place and the state cannot do anything about it, or does not want to do anything about it because it also knows that its response won't be effective and maybe counterproductive as well. I have many more things. It's fascinating, but all of you also made me think about the present and the past, the legacies of the past, and also the connections between past and present. And then I will go to the last presentation regarding transitional justice, also fascinating. I think that the first presentation to me was more about what causes violence. The second one more about how does violence take place and the mechanisms of multiple mechanisms of violence. And the third one more about post-violence, if we can call it that way. So transitional justice. So regarding that, I thought, Manuel, about, well, of course, as a Mexican, we always try to derive some lessons from your experience in Colombia, having now truth commissions in Mexico working. But regarding the Colombian case, you made me think about victims. Again, these emergent actors that become visible in the public sphere. And you said first, victims were recognized in their own rights, but then it seems to me that they took more of an activist role in the second moment. And then in the third moment, they even become critical of the outcomes. So I was wondering, how can you explain that process, if you can? If there is an evolution in terms of the role of the public and political role of victims in Colombia regarding these transitional justice processes. Maybe the process itself unleashed this evolution, maybe not, I don't know. And then lastly, I wanted to ask you, how do we assess in the end the effects of these transitional justice processes? Because you said that you mentioned that there have been partial, for example, in terms of land restitution, but much has been accomplished. So how do we assess them in terms of peace building and democracy building and all of this? And also, I was thinking about the passing of time and the generational change. So maybe the actual victims receive some concrete compensation, but how are the narratives transmitted to their children and grandchildren so that the transitional justice processes that are so hard to establish have long-lasting effects? And then to end, because I think the purpose of this is to have a conversation. So maybe if I can bridge the presentations with what follows, I was thinking of how the three presentations dialogue. So I thought of some common themes. I hope I contribute to our follow-up conversation by mentioning them. One, the problematization or the need to problematize violence, not only how we understand it, how do we measure it, what mechanisms are involved, whether it's bottom up or top down, what the multiplicity and the decentralization of actors. So not only victims and perpetrators, but many more, and also the fluid roles of these different actors, the narratives, I think, not only of the state, also of the victims or others. And also, I think it was present in all of the presentations, the subjectivity regarding violence. How do actors perceive violence, not only actual violence? And the co-construction of knowledge. And to end, based on the research that I've been doing recently on the mobilization of families of disappeared persons in Mexico, I was thinking about how can we account for also the affections and the values that run or are present in these interactions between state actors and non-state actors that may be criminal actors, but also the victims and many more actors that are involved actually in these dynamics. And I want to go back and end with this, the reading that Eve and I think Eve and it's Robinson or
Robson.
That
you and Dr. Who.
Robson, that's fascinating. Put a lot of attention on the state. It kind of showed that we can, I mean, the state is here and it will not go away. So the question is what kind of state should and can we have? So I think it made me think of, yeah, of course, the state is here, but at least in the Mexican case, the decentralization of actors has been very powerful in the past decades. So we need to think how to research this and how to produce knowledge that is we've heard this horizontal, inclusive, co-productions, all of that it's in the air, but how do we do it concretely so that we really grasp not only the political calculations or the economic incentives, but also what I think brought us here together, which is the values and the affective dimension of these dynamics. So thank you, Eve.
No, thank you so much, Yael. Thank you for the question and the comment. So we are going to the first part, the punctual question, and then the second part, because I think what you mentioned is fundamental. So Astrid, if you want, then Gemma, then Manuel.
Yes, thank you very much, Yael. I think it was a very good question. I think the violence can be in the transit between society and technoscience. In fact, the values account the possibility and the reality of violence. So the asymmetry is in the application of values, not in the co-production. Society changes what technoscience develops, and technoscience transforms the society, the practices, values, cultural approaches, etc. So the effects in society, the question is here, what are the demands? The examples I show account for the effects in society. So the question here is, what are the demands and transformations society due to technoscience in Latin America? So we are accepting or adopting certain types of technoscience projects and change our geopolitical disposition, our politics, our cultural values, military values, technical values, etc. Although to see more clearly this symmetry, these transformations, for example, your question make me question myself, what society demands so the Tren Maya was a reality in our lives. For example, to think about this co-production relationship between technoscience and society, what kind of demands, opportunities, necessities do we have as society to demand a project of this magnitude? Because it's changing the distribution, the economy, the cultural approach, the expectations of development in the South. So that's my answer. I don't know if I answer you all right. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. Gemma.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for these wonderful questions, very generative comments. Yael, I cannot believe you articulated this like just like that. And I'm really looking forward to reading your work. And hopefully when I am next time in Mexico City, we can meet. So just to address some of your questions. So in terms of the levels of ritualization, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that is central in the hundreds of cases that I have examined, there are different degrees of ritualization. So there are some that are more ritualized than others, but I would say that, to take like this term of the ideal type, no, a la Weber, if we were to speak about an ideal type of lynching in Mexico, the ritualized has a very recognizable script historically. And actually the case that I mentioned briefly of Daniel Picasso that took place in June follows the same script of the thousands that I have analyzed. And what does that script look like? It often starts with the ringing of the church bells, or the church bells are used, to communicate that something is about to happen, to congregate people. And this is also something that happened in 19th century riots in Mexico. No? I mean, so it has a very long history. I mean, obviously, like now, social media, WhatsApp is also used in order to disseminate the rumor, but usually the ringing of the church bells indicate to people that something is about to take place in the town. And then it's followed, I mean, lynching has almost like a centripetal energy. So people start congregating around the so-called perpetrator or the culprit. And they usually, you know, like they take the body, if he or she is not already, into a recognizable public space. So usually the lynching takes place like in the town's plaza, outside of a public school, outside of the church. And then they proceed to several forms of injury are done to the body. I mean, in the history of the United States, I mean, the most recognizable form of lynching was by hanging. But in Mexico, it includes the mutilation of the body, the burning. It could be hanging. It could be also like shooting the victim. What unites all of these cases is the use of an excessive use of violence. No, that is not only about killing, but about overkilling, no? Of marking the body. Now, the second question that you addressed, which I think is really important, crucial, the question of values. No? I mean, what kind of like values and complicities and bonds it creates. So the communities in which lynchings take place, and by community, I mean from like urban neighborhoods in Coyoacán, Xochimilco, historically, to like towns, for instance, San Miguel Canoa in Puebla, where several lynchings have happened historically. I mean, there's usually a sense of that through the identification of a scapegoat, the collectivity reasserts its sense of cohesiveness and security. No, I mean, so it is very kind of like a la René Girard, no, where you have the scapegoat, and the creation of a scapegoat creates this sense of cohesiveness and security. Of course, this is not to say that communities are cohesive. I mean, far from true. No, I mean, and actually, lynching can be interpreted as a way in which these communities try to assert themselves as homogeneous and try to erase all the differences that exist within them. No, I mean, between Protestant and Catholics, between like revolutionaries and anti-revolutionaries, or between like so-called like law-abiding citizens and so-called criminals, right? So there are several differences or divisions internally, but this scapegoating allows those communities to assert themselves as one. No? Now, of course, the flip side of that is that whereas it creates a sense of solidarity and taking matters into their own hands, no, I mean, vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis the criminals, vis-a-vis the others, of course, the cost is that those people that are that suffer this process of scapegoating, and even some of the witnesses, of course, endure a trauma, no? I mean, and this lives on in the community. I mean, like the families of the victims have to leave the town or live in the town, but like with fear. And there's also a sense of shame, no? I mean, like several interviews that have been done in San Miguel Canoa, no, where this very famous lynching took place in 1968. People say like, well, like I'm ashamed of being part of this town. Like people only know us as perpetrators, no? So there is a sense of like, we are not only that, but what can we do? So actually, this is something that I'm more interested in working on moving forward. And just to share with you, I was recently contacted. This is the first time this happens to me, by the family of a victim of lynching that I talk about in my book. No, I mean, so she was a woman that was lynched in 1934, accused of being a socialist, anti-clerical, and healer. And the grandson contacted me saying that he wants to know more about the story, and that anyhow. So I'm really interested more in the afterlives of lynching now. I mean, something that I didn't really necessarily explore, because as you were saying, Jael, I explore more like how it happens and how it is represented, etc. And then lastly, the question of like the state presence, and it is a tricky one. Like in many ways, I mean, of course, like many times the police is there, but it's outnumbered by the mob. And so they decide not to intervene, or sometimes out of fear as well, because they fear retaliation, and with good reason, because many times the police becomes the subject of the lynching when they try to intervene, I mean, past and present. But there is also plenty of evidence that the police many times is complicit with the lynch mob. I mean, and that they themselves either participate in the killing with the orders of a major, of like in conjunction with like some kind of like local cacique, or that they at least condone the use of violence. No, I mean, and again, a very clear example of the fluidity between state-sanctioned forms of violence and lynching is the fact that throughout the post-revolutionary period, we have this practice called la ley fuga, no? The law of flee, or the flee law, no? I mean, which was allegedly used against criminals or suspected criminals upon their attempt to escape the law. I mean, these were basically extrajudicial killings, no, by the police and by the military. And there are several cases in which a lynching ends up in a ley fuga, no? I mean, like people were trying to lynch a criminal, and at the end, the police takes him or her away, only to then apply them the flee of law, no, or the ley fuga, no? So it's, again, the fluidity is enough to show that is certainly not a question only of a state capacity, no? I mean, and there's this, I mean, and we can, I know that we're going to continue this dialogue, because I think one of the failures of when people think about responses to these kinds of phenomena, and they think that it's only about strengthening the institutions, they wrongly say we need to bring more police. No, I mean, like, no, it's not about bringing more police. It's about, in any case, you need to increase the legitimacy of the police, or the ways in which people perceive that police as being on their side. But it's certainly not about just increasing a state presence without critically thinking how that state looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. Manuel?
Yes, thank you very much for your question, which I find really interesting. And the first question about the role of the victims and activists is a very important. You can notice in the presentation that the role change from maybe totally absent of the presence of victims in the creation of the first transitional system with the paramilitaries. Just they mention, and there is a beautiful discourse by the government in the law, but there are no participation and agency of the victims in the first moment. And the second moment, because this, we have to keep in mind that every single system that I have been talking about try to fix the mistakes of the first one, and then the second one is like, okay, we have a really a strong victims organization in our country. Sadly, due to the long conflict that we already have, but also as a scholar, we make a very common mistake, is to conceive this organization as a homogeneous way of thinking. Inside them, within them, there are some particular position over particularly the reparation, economical reparation, because for some very radical activists and victims, economical reparation can be as a threat of disarticulate the movement. When you feel as a victim or your family repair, you don't have the same will to be an activist. And it seems like in this process, money and reparation and the way the government and the state politize and instrumentalize this reparation, it can be for some of this organization as a way of dividing them. Yeah. And also regarding the second question about the effects and how we as scholars on institution measure the effects and of this transitional justice system, this is a very important question, because in the first experience, in the first moment, they didn't create institution to follow these procedures, to follow the impact in society of this. But in the last one, there are some institutions that they are inside the law that they has to be created. For example, in the case of the Truth Commission, when the Truth Commission hand over the final report, there is this group that is gonna watch how this report are going to be absorbed or socialized with the society. And then there are not this kind of civilians institution that can measure in this previous experience of transitional justice. And then we can see how the system is every now and then more and more adequate to the context. And also it's related, this measurement, with the question that you have about discourse and reality. Because in these laws you find it's a law for angels. It's a very beautiful, it sounds really beautiful: truth, justice, non-repetition, peace building. But in the moment that the government are going to instrumentalize this transitional justice system, they have been facing really strong challenges: distances, digital, pandemia, now with this last one. And also we have to keep in mind, when we think about this, is that we still have a conflict. That means that the transitional justice system in Colombia is a very sui generis kind of transitional system. It's a transitional system without completely transition. Then we have to, as a scholar, find out ways to conceptualize this kind of transition. Transition for who? No, not for every society, because non-repetition, you cannot speak about non-repetition when you have still an ongoing conflict in Colombia. And they start to change the narrative in this last part of the transitional justice. They are not talking about non-repetition, but non-continuation. And then you see also the narrative is adapting to the context constantly. And the last question, going to be short, about the reparation victims and the narrative to the next generation. This is very important, because and now there are parallel phenomenon. The history is going to be again in the classroom in Colombia. They're going to prioritize among the social science history, but recent history, talking about the conflict to the scholars. And then the teacher, and they create a commission to make a transition of this very hard knowledge to a more didactic knowledge for students and the new generations. And this is very important. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. So before we start the roundtable, Robson have some questions that was shared with us in YouTube, and also maybe some of the people who are gathering with us right now here in the Zoom, maybe you want to ask some question, and then we are going to go to the roundtable. So Robson.
Thank you, Ivy. Before to share with you some commentaries that appeared in YouTube, I just want to thank each presentation of today. I think each one was absolutely important for us to have some ideas about the different cases of violence in Latin America. As I said before, I think this opportunity to debate and think about these issues is very, very important. So, and to be very quickly, I have just one question too. I just want to ask the panelists, what do you think is the role currently of religion to overcome this scenario of violence in Latin America? As we know, during the building of our history, in many moments, especially during the colonization process, the Catholic Church and the Christianism in general permitted some violence against indigenous people or African enslaved people. But now, how could be, or what is indeed the role of religions in general and Christianism in a specific way to get the peace, or at least to end the violence in Latin America conflicts? For example, in the case of Colombia, how is the role of Catholic Church or any another church in this process of negotiations of peace? In case of Mexico too, I think that Mexico has a great role of Catholic Church in the country. How could be this or is indeed this role of religion or Christianity or Catholic Church in this overcoming of the situations of violence. So I don't know if everyone knows, but we are doing a transmission, live transmission in YouTube, and there we have had more than 40 people that passed through and watched our seminar. And there we had 2 comments from.
So if you want, just Robson.
Yeah.
If you want, we go with your question first.
Yep.
And then the comment. And I want to start with Gemma, because I think what she had worked is our religion is a justification or a promoter of violence. And then maybe, Gemma, you can conclude with Truth Commission, where there is Jesuit today, maybe, whatever you want. So Gemma, then Astrid, then Manuel, and also Yael, because Yael is working a lot of what you are asking.
Yes, thank you. I actually appreciate very much this question, because the book project that I'm working on right now, which developed out of my first book, has to do with the role of religion in legitimating violence, and also trying to ask, you know, what can religion do, or how can faithful communities or like religious leaders do to prevent that violence? So I will just start by saying that indeed, in the hundreds of cases of lynchings that I examined, especially those that were connected to religious questions, but even those that did not necessarily were so overtly about religion, had the participation of religious authorities. No? So the priest as a figure of authority at the local level, had a central role both in disseminating the rumors against transgressors, I mean, especially Protestants, but also people that identify with socialist or communist ideas, and also some of the state actors that were not welcome by these communities, and that were meddling in local affairs, no? Especially the land reform and also education programs that were secularizing and that were in some ways, or in many ways sometimes, anti-clerical. So the priests were central, and also ultimately what I show is that people themselves also, beyond the authority of the church or of this priest at the local level, they also appropriated like certain like meanings of martyrdom and sacrificial violence in order to legitimate their actions. No? I mean, so it wasn't necessarily that they needed the official sanctioning of the church or of the ecclesiastical authorities in order to justify their use of violence, but that there were also like alternative renderings of what being a martyr was, no? Where they blended the figure of the martyr with that of the hero or that of the warrior that not only dies in the name of Christ, but is also willing to kill in the name of Christ. No? So certainly, and Robson, you were mentioning this, no? I mean, historically in Latin America, the church has had, the Catholic Church in specific, has had a role in, you know, like legitimating or contributed to render violence as a legitimate means to defend religion or to defend the integrity of certain communities. However, I mean, again, my work shows, I mean, first of all, that it wasn't necessarily like ecclesiastical authorities per se, because there was a lot of divisions, and the church, of course, similar to the state, is a very complex set of institutions and practices. So there were like plenty of divisions between church authorities, no? I mean, the higher ranks of the church, and then like the priest at the local level, and also within Catholics themselves. No? I mean, Catholics that believe that the best way to defend religion was through peaceful means and through peaceful forms of protest. So there is a legacy that can contribute to think ways in which we can build peace. No? And I would like to mention that in the contemporary context in Mexico, there is plenty of initiatives, especially from Jesuits, but from other groups within the church that have been very, very critical on the war on drugs in Mexico, and that have been pushing for a non-punitive approach to the drug question. No, I mean, and how to create reconciliation and how to build peace. I mean, in other words, how to move from the war on drugs to a model of peace building that incorporates or that recognizes the drug problem as a health issue, as a question that has to do with development and with economic needs, and that requires us to think about moving beyond these binary notions that there are like some quote unquote like bad guys that are involved on drugs and that the rest of society has nothing to do with them, no? And that as long as the war on drugs is killing those bad guys, then the rest of society can be in peace, no? And so there is a very concerted effort on behalf of voices from Catholicism and other religions in terms of like pushing for a more like for a peace building approach. And the last thing I would say is that historically, in regards to lynchings, there is a good lesson to be taken from the case of the United States. No, I mean, in the United States, as I said, like lynching was, I mean, as you know, like lynching was a prevalent practice up to the 1930s, 1940s. No, and what changed? I mean, why lynchings declined in the U.S. and why they have continued in Mexico and in so many Latin American societies? And one of the key factors that changed was that it emerged, a critical mass emerged amongst civil society organizations and amongst church leaders in terms of being critical of this form of violence, no? A concerted effort to criticize what was happening in the country and to denounce the human rights violations that were being committed by perpetrators. So I believe that not only in terms of drug-related violence, but also in terms of lynchings and other more disorganized forms of violence, religious leaders, religious organizations, and people of faith have a central role in helping denounce these events and creating, again, alternative narratives that move beyond war-making narratives and towards peace-building initiatives.
Thank you, Gemma. I'm sure your answer also will provoke more questions, but Astrid, in your case, it's not only the Catholic religion. Also, we know our president has a messianic will, but also we are leading with, in the case of Mexico, I don't know the case in Colombia, with a very strong religion, tourism and religion, deep-root religion, all mixed together. So maybe you can once again explain the Mayan zone and what does that mean? Because also an interesting part of the train is the discovery of temples all around the road, no? So maybe because we have colleagues from India and from Argentina, so maybe you could explain a bit the religious issues.
Okay, I will try. First, I want to answer Robson's question about what is the role of religion, specifically thinking about science and technology. I think religion provides critical tools through its values and narratives to overcome the violence and not accept the technoscientific projects just because science and technology are related to progress. There is not the case, no? Technoscience helps to develop society and individuals, but we should not accept it just as it is. We need to be critical, using the more tools we could use, and religion is one of them. This not supposed to evaluate only by its values, but incorporate it as one tool available in the toolbox. We have to be alert about the relationship between technoscience and religion, because there are religious values, and these values can lead to develop technoscientific projects. Specifically with the Mayan train, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the actual president of Mexico, certainly has a messianic narrative, like if he was if he is the pater familias, like if he is the father of all the nation. His gestures, like with his arms open in propaganda or in marketing, he does supposes his messianic approach to people, and he talks about pueblo, the pueblo and the people. The pueblo is a specific type of person. He's not talking to everyone. So when he talks about the Mayan train, he talks, or he refers to poor people or people with economic with low economic status. So his main narrative, or his main discourse of the Mayan train is about economic development. The south is the low economic region of Mexico, especially Campeche, Chiapas, Oaxaca, maybe Tabasco. There are the south states in Mexican Republic. So the Tren Mayan train tried to start economic exchanges in this region, but not only by local people, but to transnationals or enterprises of other parts of the world, especially because Quintana Roo, Cancun, Playa del Carmen has a reaching economic section because of the tourism of the beaches and other places. So maybe the Mayan train will start the economic development in the region, but at what cost? No. So I think this is my answer. I hope it answers your question, Robson, and your question.
Thank you, Astrid. Excellent. Thank you so much. Manuel?
Yeah, the role of the church in peace and building and violence in the same time has been very dynamic through history in Colombia. I can mention, for example, previous to this conflict that we have now, the last transitional justice recognized from 1958 to 2016. Previous to this conflict, we have a period in Colombia called La Violencia with capital letter. And this period, were very well known that Catholic priests, they promote violence through the church, through the pulpit, through the sermon, because this violence was between liberal and conservative party, and these priests, not all of them, some of these priests were promoting violence, but they have a conservative party affiliation. But it changed with the time when the conflict changed, and for example, in 1958, when this period of violence ended with an agreement between these two political parties that were the political elite were fueling and encouraging the people in the regions to fight one another. And then the peace agreement signed in Spain in 1958 that ends this period of terrible violence, very brutal violence, and very brutal repertory of violence. And the church, the Catholic Church, was very crucial in this peace treaty between liberal and conservative. And it called the Frente Nacional, and give the opportunity to every political party, liberal and conservative, to rule the country for 4 years. And even though the election were not the result that they expect, I mean, they changed 4 years for the liberal and 4 years for the conservatives. And then the Catholic Church during the 80s has also very popular figures in the guerrillas. We have this Camilo Torres Restrepo is the guerrilla priest, el cura guerrillero, very popular, very charismatic figure that was killed in combat by the, he belongs to the ELN, Army of Popular Liberation, and he was affiliated by Theology of Liberation way of thinking. And but also, and then now, what is the role of the church in this new transitional system? As a very important figure of the Catholic Church from a Jesuit community, the president of the Truth Commission, Francisco de Roo. And Francisco de Roo is a moral figure and reminds me very much Desmond Tutu in South Africa, because this figure promotes legitimacy and accountability in a very, very it can be a very aggressive political environment against the transitional justice system that has been implemented. And he is this figure, he's the face of the Truth Commission, and it has been like a shield, of moral shield for this institution. And then you can see through these examples how the role of church have been pushing some politics and pushing some peace building process in place in Colombia.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you so much. Now I will give the word to Esteban Elay Flores, is the philosopher and the priest from the Archdiocese of Monterrey in northern Mexico.
Thank you very much, Yves, for the invitation to participate in this seminar. I need to tell you that this is the first time I participate in a kind of dialogue about violence, and this is part of my answer to Robson's question. And this is part of the problem we live, and I speak you as a member of the Catholic Church. I am a Catholic priest, and this is a reality. We most of the time are more committed in our communities to try to grow within them. And the problem is that Catholic Church, okay, better to say not just a problem, but a challenge, because it's not only Catholic Church. I understand this as a part of a society which has to participate all together. But of course, the part from religions, we need to begin to understand more each other's issues within our communities, for we all have a lot of opportunity to learn from each other. This is part of, for example, Pope Francis is trying to address in this Catholic narrative about not only morals, but also and especially how we assume and receive the message from the gospel, to internalize more, not only rules and this kind of practices to do. We need to understand more what does these practices compel us, make us traduce into that society's reality. People in our communities sometimes live and endure a kind of trials which cannot be simply addressed by one sermon, by some general rules from Catholic morality or Christian morality. And that's one issue we need to address more among us. Second thing I wanted to tell you, I think it is important to open the philosophical and anthropological part of this. Every individual needs a kind of identity in his or her community. And you were speaking about violence in different levels, small communities. This lynching is part of sometimes people's need of having something own. We need to defend our ownness. We need to have something that protects us. And this creates a very complex relationships among people. And this is always the challenge in every community, in every society. As Manuel told us, that the victims were not included into the transitional system discourse. And why this happens? Because we as human beings need to be listened. We need to become part of a group. And the resource of dialogue among our people, we as priests and the faithful people in our churches and communities, we the most part of the time have not the real opportunity to express, to be listened, and to identify ourselves as not only as one group, but as human beings. I think this is also a very important part to keep in mind when we speak about religions, because the principal task of religions is to humanize, also to help people to be fully human, to become fully human in their acts, their thoughts, their efforts, and to build relationships for peace. Because a real human relationship is that make others be more close to each other. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. We will follow up with some of the question and some of the challenges you just mentioned, and I will ask Julia Young to share with us some of her view regarding the topic. So Julia is an historian, specialist in migration, but also she is an activist. May I say so, Julia?
I guess so.
She worked a lot with her father, helping migrant women in the frontier, and she gives some of her summertime helping migrant women. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Eve, and hi, everybody. And I'll just start with a couple qualifiers. One is that I'm home today with my 3 kids who happen to have a holiday, so I'm been dipping in and out of the conversation, and so anything I say will probably just repeat what other people have said, and I'm sorry if it seems like I'm not responding. I just may not have heard. But you know, I'm really interested in this topic of the relationship between religion and violence, and my academic work, my first book focused on the history of the role of a religious conflict in Mexico and migration to the United States, and the ways that migrants fled violence, and often religious violence, and then came to the United States and responded to that conflict from the United States. So I'm really interested in the ways that, you know, in religious politics, in religious violence, in the ways that that can impact migration. I think when we're thinking about religion and violence, it's really important to think, well, as a historian, it's sort of important to think about what has changed over the longer period. I mean, if you just look at Mexico over the course of the 20th century, or if you could start this clock in the late 19th century, there are many instances where there are religious figures, clergy, or members of the institutional church that are instigating violence, right? That are participating in violence and promoting violence because they have, partly as a reaction to being targeted or restricted by the state. So, I mean, one thing you always have to look at is the relationship between church and state and and how it changes over time. And at times in Mexican history, the church has been very in conflict with the state. And then at other times, the church has, like after 1940, for example, you see the church and the state really coming much closer together, having similar goals, working together to repress even some of that same religious violence that was happening on the ground. And so I guess that's one thing I would say is, you know, it all depends on the time and the place and the relationship between church and state. I think if you look more broadly at Latin America, well, in Mexico and Latin America over the course of the 20th century, you see some really interesting, you see different moments. You see, for example, in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, the clergy is subject to restrictions, harassment, violence, and leaves. And many members of the clergy leave Cuba and reestablish themselves in the United States and become one of the kind of poles of Cuban American resistance to the Castro government. So, you know, the church is always kind of involved in politics. It's sometimes, the church and the clergy is sometimes subject to violence and sometimes promotes or at least participates in that violence. You know, I thought about the book that Steve Andes and I edited on the Catholic Church, and Eve has a piece in that on the Catholic Church, really on Catholics and political activism in the 20th century in Latin America, and how you have these moments, as you know, in Colombia and in Argentina and other places where the church is working to promote peace, prevent guerrilla violence, to resist the authoritarian governments in ways that, you know, were in some instances really, really heroic and really important. And then other times and places where the church is collaborating, or members of and it's always that problem of how do we talk about the church, right? Because it's never one unified opinion. You have bishops and clergy people who are allied with particular political parties or political movements. But anyway, I guess this is a rambling and long way of saying that it's complicated. The only other thing I would think about now, and when I talk about when I give one talk frequently on the history of Catholicism in Mexico, and that's at the State Department. People often ask about the role of the church now with regard to immigration and drug trafficking. And I would say that now you see members of the clergy in Mexico really speaking out against narco violence in particular. Again, it's not the entire unified church, it's sort of members in particular places. And then you also see members of the church, and I've been really inspired by this on a personal level, working to assist migrants on the ground, to speak out against migrants being targeted by, you know, even by narco traffickers or by coyotes or other, you know, other sources of violence, and working really hard to combat that violence and speak out against that violence. So I guess, again, that's all just to say it's complicated. It depends on the relationship between church and state. It depends on the time period you're talking about and the place you're talking about, but it's always important, I think, that relationship between, between the church and Catholics and violence. So that's all I'll say. Thank you to all of you for your interesting contributions and comments.
No, thank you so much, Julia. Now we are going to listen also to Yael. Before Yael share with us, also, I think part of what Gema work is Protestant violence and also some violence and martyrdom that go further religion, no? And also some of the work of Marisol Lopez Menendez regarding civic martyrdom. But Yael, please.
Thank you, Robson, for the question. I would answer in a broader sense, not focusing only on the Catholic Church, based on what preliminary findings from my research. So I found that among the collectives of families of disappeared victims, spirituality is a key element in their meaning building, meaning finding, as they search for their loved ones. Not necessarily the church. Not every person says, I go to church. Some people say it's my faith in God, and I practice it privately. So I think that's why I said I want to answer it in a broader way. Also, in terms of my schema of analysis, I am trying to find out what is the role of actors, multiple actors that show solidarity. And I found that in many cases, it's particular priests and not necessarily the church. So that's another finding that, and sometimes these priests have to face resistance within the church or other kinds of resistances. And also what's been interesting is to find that the collectives are formed by people from different religious denominations. So, and how they also build an inclusive narrative within the collective. So it doesn't matter which denomination you come from, if you have a loved one who's disappeared, you can join and you're part of this family. So that's another aspect that I found. And finally, I would, of course, also priests, sometimes because I've been to the churches to listen to the discourses sometimes on important occasions, sometimes on not so important occasions for the community. But I found, like you said, a variety of narratives, some that are more openly resistant and some that are more cautious. And I'm still finding out why. Why are they framing their discourses in this way? And lastly, I would say the role of ourselves as researchers. So bringing in also spirituality. The priest Esteban talked about making humanity. So I think when you study these themes, it's very important to have a high spirit, regardless of what your religion is, and to be empathetic and to look at the human condition with sensitivity. So I think that's part also of religion, the way I understand it, and also the institutional support that we get from religious institutions. For example, in my case, from Iberoamericana University, which is a Jesuit institution, and for this institution, these topics are of key importance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yael. Also, while you were sharing your thoughts, I think for our colleagues that are not from Latin America, it's important to understand that there is different tradition of laical states within Latin America. In the case of Mexico, for example, we have more than 1 century of state and church separation. I think we have to take that on mind. And it's only recently, the last 30 years, that there is a new legal relationship between all the different churches and the state. And the Catholic Church has no longer the monopoly of religion in Mexico. No, something similar is at work at Brazil, but the situation in Chile, in Argentina, is quite different. So the interaction between church, religion, and the violence are also different. Max, maybe you can speak to us the tension that exists in Argentina with the role of the bishops. I don't want to say the role of the provincial of the Jesuits during the dictatorship, because it was said that one of the reasons Pope Francis was not elected before was the possible role he played during the dictatorship, no, and the exile he lived within the company. So maybe Max, I know it's a difficult topic. Just remember you are being recorded.
Yeah. For that is a good thing. No, it's so difficult for me to speak about it. I'm not a specialist, no, in this. I only are some Argentina person and Catholic person. So my experience is only this, no. Always I try to understand, no, what happened in our history, but it's not easy to explain it, no. Maybe the pattern is seems maybe around the world, no. Church, we have people always that think it's better the way to propose right, for example, in politics, no, and people that identify more than discourse or values of left, no. That's is similar in all countries, in Europe or in other zones, no. In Argentina, we had a moment, no, in the history with dictatorship, and the real thing was that people of church, bishop or priest or likes, are very close to dictatorship government, and people that was very contrary to it and fight with this regime, no, dictator regime. So I don't know, it's not easy to explain more than this, not. If you want, I always are particular more close to people, no. I see maybe I don't know, to left, but to people, that is a very important category in Argentina. Like I think that Asterix say in some moment, this category of people. I don't know if the same now it is used in Mexico, but for me it's an important category. I think maybe for Pope Francis also. But I had a lot of good friend, professor, good people that think in a different way, no, and understand culture and reality in a different way. So maybe that's always for me is some kind of crisis, no, because I have my intuition, but I can understand that others have another intuition, no. So in this sense, for me, it's important not confrontation, no, to separate, no, to go up these two ways, no, and think points of common, no. That could be my idea. Also in politics, no. Now in Argentina is a very time of confrontation between those models of politics, but for me, no one offer a real solution, no. We need to go open all of these solutions. In church, for me, is similar. And yeah, the history we know, no, who is the history of Pope. I can, you know that I work in Vatican, no, so I can't say more of that. And I had a question for another question, maybe help me to go in another way and to leave this argument, but maybe for other moment. But in the three case that for me was very interesting, my question is what was the and what is now maybe the role of international power is in this case now of Mexico and Colombian case, it was a positive role or negative role or both. There is some explanation. See, it was better, no? Better in what thing was better, the presence of international powers, or in what was bad, no? For this conflict in Colombia and in Mexico, in the question of violence and the question of technoscience and guerrilla in Colombia.
Thank you, Max. Astrid, maybe you want to start with last question of Max regarding foreign powers. I know it's a topic because our president always tells us that Mexico is no more an American colony. So there is a lot to say. And also, I don't know if Marta and Andrew, if you have any question, please feel free to raise your hands and we can take any question. Astrid.
Certainly, international powers, foreign powers, has a negative role in these two examples I gave in my presentation, because in the case of Colombia, the state has no more influence in, or at least a little influence in this coal mine. The politics around the coal mine has no good effects or positive effects in the communities that I mentioned earlier, because the people are still fighting for their rights, and there are a lot of murders, disappearance of people, of activists, especially the Guayu community activists or activism, because it's the people who is more damaged by the extractivism in this coal mine. In the Mayan train, the thing is about the licitations in the construction of this train and the further projects around it. So I don't know what can we do using this notion of co-production between technoscience and society to resolve these violence conflicts in the society and in the production of technoscience, to develop economically, politically, socially. No, so I keep in mind this question, because I think it's important to think about what can we do with technoscience to resolve these conflicts. Not only think technoscience in a bad way as a destructive mode of approach to society, to develop society or to destruct society, but to think about technoscience as a way to construct in a creative way ways of transform society in a positive way. I think that's my answer.
Thank you so much, Astrid. Gemma, I have my own point regarding the violent process of Mexico and the role of foreigners. But what do you think regarding lynching? Because sometimes there is different level of international participants. Some are states like the US, that is very important, but some are also transnational construction, like the justice courts, international justice courts, etc. So what have you seen? And maybe there is some positive international actions that are in place.
No, for sure. I mean, I think this is a very relevant question, no? Because in my own research on violence, I mean, I tend to focus on the local because I like to analyze the microdynamics of violence. However, I also think about different levels of analysis, and especially for this project that I'm working on right now on religious violence, it is important for me to understand the complexities. I mean, as I said, like unpack the category of the state, unpack the category of the Catholic Church, and see how those operate many times in contradictory ways at these different levels of analysis. No? I mean, the local, the state level, the national level, and then transnational. So in terms of religious violence, I only wanted to, like to say that I echo everything that Julia said, and I think the summary of that, I mean, the gist of this argument that I'm also trying to push forward is that the relation between religion and violence is ambivalent. No, I mean that this is something that Scott Appleby has said, no, on the ambivalence of the sacred, or also the work of William Cavanaugh, no, I mean in his myth of religious violence, which is it can go either way. No, I mean the thing is to analyze the potential for harm, but also the potential for peace building and transforming societies. So in the case of, for instance, anti-Protestant violence, no, I mean this is something that happened at the same time in the 1940s and 1950s in Mexico, in Colombia, in Brazil, the cases that I know of. So here it's important to understand that like anti-Protestant violence in Mexico was connected to intra-community conflicts that had to do with very local reasons like politics, divisions over land, access to resources, but it also had to do with the Vatican. No, I mean, so you have a very strong, international actor that in this particular case was promoting anti-Protestant campaigns in this region, allegedly due to the perceived advancement of this quote unquote foreign religion that was attacking Catholic religion that was perceived as the authentic religion of the nation. I mean, so the Vatican was clearly unleashing these anti-Protestant campaigns in these countries. And even though it didn't necessarily openly say, go and lynch Protestants, I mean, the fact that it was enabling this type of reaction towards Protestantism translated at the local level, I mean, interacting with intra-community conflicts and unleash this violence against Protestants. I mean, so again, it's not necessarily a cause effect, like a linear relationship. It's always mediated by, by all these other levels of analysis, but the Vatican play, in this case, a very important role, I mean, in these anti-Protestant campaigns. On the other hand, and I should also say, like the United States, because so many migrants were returning from the Bracero program from the United States, converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, these transnational factors, I mean, this migration, these returnees that had converted to Protestantism, contributed also to this perception that Protestantism was increasing in Mexico. On the other hand, the flip side of the story is that the United States, of course, and this is something that Julia has studied as well, in many ways, it offered refuge to so many of these people that were escaping or fleeing violence. It also offered a place from which human rights denunciations could be articulated. And I would say that this continues to happen today. I mean, the questions of advocacy and human rights, when international pressure is put on Mexico, and that is particularly from the United States because of the asymmetrical relation the US and Mexico have. So when the New York Times covers an assassination, then the government feels the need to do something about it. So the US, I mean, moving from religious violence to, let's say, drug-related violence, has a lot of responsibility because of arms trafficking, because of consumption of drugs. But on the other hand, it also offers a transnational platform where human rights organizations can denounce these incidents and can have some repercussions in terms of what political elites do about it in Mexico. So it's not always negative. I mean, it can be positive. It can go both ways.
Thank you, Gemma. Manuel, in the case of Colombia?
In the case of Colombia, I mean, it's also, I would like to underline what Gemma has said. It's a very changeable role of the international power, not just in the conflict, but also in the peace building. Because, for example, I mean, we through reading history of Colombia, you can recent history, you can see how international forces ideologically and logistically have been influence the conflict and helping the government and, for example, United States to fight drug trafficking, to fight terrorists when they were considered terrorists during the Álvaro Uribe Vélez presidential period. And it change depends on the relation that international power have with the government at that time. And also the first initiative of transitional justice system, the first initiative of peace building, international community, international court of crime, the pressure of this institution forced the government of Álvaro Uribe Vélez to create this transitional system, but it plays a double role of avoiding international interference and also address some of the human rights for the victims, even though the victims complained and the law was very controversial in terms of the effectiveness. And then we can see how the international forces play this double role of fuel and influence the conflict in a really bad way, like weapons. They give the government weapons and armory, even though they know that the government itself were violating human rights. And then even though there were already sentences by international court that human forces were really close to the paramilitaries illegal forces. But also the international human rights organization have played a role in make this organization in a national level strong and strong and strong, and also educate them in human rights and activism. And this is a very important role in the international force playing in the case of Colombia nowadays.
Thank you, Manuel. Yael, you have studied and most of your research is about transnational networks, and also yourself, you are part of a transnational network of researchers, and you are working on Latin American, all over Latin America with other researchers working on forced displacement. What could you answer to Maximiliano's question regarding the role and the importance of the foreign powers and the different level, because also you work with different organizations at once to go transnational?
Well, yes, by the way, Eve, I think Andrew had his hand raised. So just so that you know, before, I think so. Well, but the work I do is different because it's not about putting pressure on anyone, but really about building collaborations across the region. So just for the participants and those who are listening so that they understand why you're asking me this, we've created a network of researchers, but also NGO activists and people from the ministries of education in Latin America to pursue Holocaust education, genocide education. So that's what we've been building together with some US organizations, but also UNESCO, museums. So I think maybe it's important in the sense that we're bringing together different actors of society, not only working from academia with academics, but also opening up spaces with other actors of society, thinking in the lines of this conversation, peace building, right? And having the humanistic values as a motor force in this. So on this, and as you know, if we faced a lot of resistance as well. So either by governments or by institutions or by actors within institutions. So it hasn't been easy, but I think overall we've created good educational programs, including the ones that you have developed. So.
Thank you so much, Yael. Andrew, please, can you open your mic?
Okay, thanks very much. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm very grateful that I've been able to attend to it, to attend on it. I just have one comment to make. I'm very pleased that this issue of international participation in violence and peace building came up. I'm not sure if it was Hema who raised it first or McClean. They certainly reinforced each other's position. But these are not the question of violence. While of course there's local manifestations and national manifestations, violence in and of itself is not neither a local nor a national kind of a problem. It is an international issue. It is the accepted way that we solve problems. And the war framing, shall we say, that we use conflict, that we talk about a war on drugs rather than resolving the issue, that we talk about wars on this, wars on that, right? And this is something that is, well, the accepted way of solving things is supposed to be through conflict and through violence, right? Even for the sake of something that's good. And so the international participation in changing that discussion and changing that framing to something that involves peace initiatives and building peace, it's also essential to the discussion. It's also essential to the resolution. Without there being an international approval, an international sanctioning that we solve things in a different way, we define problems in different kinds of ways, we define possible resolutions in different kinds of ways, peace initiatives are not going to work on a local level. Peace initiatives are not going to work on a national level. They set an example, right? You know, people can dedicate their lives to them in the hope that something bigger will come from them. But unless there's international participation, their peace initiatives are going to be more of a manifestation of a desire rather than a solution to a problem. That's simply what I wanted to say, and I'm glad there was an opportunity to be with you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Manuel, can you go and retake some of Andrew's reflection regarding the Colombian case, please?
Yes, I totally agree when he said that a war in a local level is a war in the world, and also a peace building in a local context doesn't work if we don't have international community and international participation. Regarding transitional justice system, every single one of them since 1997 in Sierra Leone have been with the participation of international actors, because it's really important also when you sign a peace with a guerrilla movement, there is the need of the third part that recognize a third country that recognize this belligerent, because otherwise they are going to be treated as a terrorist or an armed illegal group. And for this reason, I would like to add this, another reason why it's so important, the international power and international intervention in a soft way, no?
Excellent, Manuel. Yael, can you also go with that comment of Andrew, because I really want to know how does it feel when you speak with Chilean, and is that idea that it's an international problem or it's a local problem? What is at stake?
So I think if the program that UNESCO has developed in the region brings, I think we can learn a lot from it. I think one thing that we set as a priority is to look at national contexts. So certainly whatever works for Mexico, I mean, it might work somewhere else, but we need to take into account the national history, the national politics, no, the particular actors that are involved, their agendas. So that's, and also, for example, in terms of facing the traumatic past. So Argentina has a long trajectory developing programs and Mexico does not. So we also have to take that into consideration. And then how is this relevant for each country? Then if you go, of course, to the subnational level, you have to add more complexities, because what works for Mexico City may not work for Mérida, Yucatan, right? And that will happen in every country as well. And in fact, it has been interesting to learn, for example, that this may relate to Andrew's comments, that in some cities in Chile, there are memory sites outside of Santiago. In Mexico, this is happening more and more, but it's being more from the bottom up, right? From either victim groups or together with the support of NGOs, more than from the state. So again, I mean, this adds to the complexity, but I agree that we may create models, local models that may have echo for a different site, even within the same country, not or across countries. And then if you're able to create these collaborations, the positive part is the knowledge that you exchange, right? And I don't know how you say this in English, los saberes, no? That are travel throughout these circuits that are created within a country, across countries, within the region, across regions, because the UNESCO, this program is global. So it also involves India and some African countries and many countries that have had a painful and traumatic past.
Thank you, Yael. Gemma and Dr. Hu. Gemma and then Dr. Hu.
Yes, no, this is certainly very important, and thank you for this. For these thoughts about the international or the international character of violence. I mean, I would echo some of the things that Yael was saying, because I'm going to share with you, I was an author and editor of a book on human security and chronic violence in Mexico. And this was a collective effort with several researchers on the ground in 4 different communities in Mexico, highly affected by violence. And what we discovered through the work with these communities is that you cannot change the situation of violence at the local level without taking into account the local needs of these people, no? I mean, and that many of the interventions, quote unquote interventions, that international organizations have pushed for, or even foundations, no, with lots of money and lots of resources, haven't been successful because they do not take into account what are people's needs and what people conceive as security threats. No? I mean, so for instance, just to give you an example, one of the communities that we work with is located in Tijuana, no? In a very high levels of crime neighborhood, a lot of insecurity. However, contrary to what the media says or the government claims, for people at the local level, it wasn't drug trafficking what was the main concern for them in their everyday lives. It was robberies. It was the impossibility to take public transportation without knowing that they were not going to be robbed. It was access to potable water. It was the possibility of walking at night. No, so what is a citizen security intervention or money that is full into these communities in order allegedly to create more peaceful societies, but based on a very inaccurate assessment of what these communities need. No, I mean, an assessment that focuses on drug trafficking organizations. No, I mean, it seems that all the conversation on violence in Mexico is captured by this notion that is all drug trafficking. No, I mean, it all has to do with organized crime. No? And so that creates these dangerous and harmful blind spots, no? When we stop thinking and looking at other needs that people have on the ground. No? So I'm going to share with you this book because it has a lot of lessons. It was a book that was thought about and created with this methodology from below, in conversation with local communities. And what we created was this academic book, but we also created what we call citizen security agendas built in conversation with communities. You know? So it's an effort to, again, take into account locals' needs and the ways in which we can create more peaceful society and more sustainable initiatives, but actually listening to what people need, which is very different, as Yael was saying too. I mean, from community to community, from state to state, and from country to country.
Thank you, Gemma. Dr. Hu?
I just follow the Gemma's comment. That's the role of civil society and how the civil society contribute in the daily life of a community. And it's significant. And the stereotypical image of Mexico is drug. And that's the question of two images come to my mind. One is drug, that's tradition about Mexico. The other one is Our Lady Guadalupe. If you put these two images together and you see what is the problem in our society and in our country, and what is the cultural tradition in the past contribute to the problem we have today. That's what talking about values and moralities. And then the question about religion and the politics, then international powers. We are talking about institutions, and all the institutions are similar in structure, in characteristic, and functions, and these different ways of running institutions, religious institutions, political institutions. At the very beginning, they had the same goal to live in a communal life, but all of a sudden changed. When it changed, and one of the books we read during the seminar, the author said, religion is run in a political way. Politics is run as a religion. So politics, it runs just like a religion, and the religion runs just like a politics. So now you cannot distinguish what is the religion, what is the politics. They can be the same. So that's the problem of institutions we are talking about. And conceptually, both politics and religion is good for people, for community. But the problem now we have is the institution problem, similar as international institutions.
Sorry.
So then all of this come to the question I would think is power, authority, and how to solve this. You need the people's power, need the civil society, and to work on from bottom up, not only from top down. Top, who run the international institutions? That's another question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. Manuel, do you want to answer or reflect on what Dr. Hu just shared with us, the importance of institutions and the way that politics run in a religious way and religion runs in a political way?
It's a very profound comment and related with the very philosophical thought that the role of civil society and institutions. I mean, it can be seen as a collective or as an individual level, and but institutions. I mean, I don't know, the institutions make the people every time is participating more and more in the decisions that are made in public organizations. In the case of Colombia, but the religions, I don't know if it's the case in Colombia that religions work as a politics and politics work as a religion. I don't know if I can agree if this is the case of Colombia. I have reflect on this, and I have to think more about this to answer properly the question or the comment.
Thank you, Manuel. Yes, it's quite Astrid. No, Max first, and then Astrid.
No, only, but I would like to make another question, but I don't know if the moment because it's very related with this.
Okay,
or maybe
do
for later.
No, do it, and then
no,
Astrid.
if the presenter has some example of the role of art in this process, no? For sure, there are a lot of good examples of compromise in Mexico and Brazil and Colombia. For sure, it maybe is very, very useful and necessary to put in the table also the role of art, no, in this music or pictures or literature, no, and so on.
Thank you, Max. Astrid, could you reflect deeper on what Dr. Hu mentioned, and maybe link it to Max's reflection? I think technoscience and art are linked, and also art is part of the protest in Latin America. Songs and drawing and painting and everything. But what do you think of the role of the institutions? And Manuel also told us, in the case of Colombia, it didn't seem to work like politics is run as religion, and religion is run as politics. Maybe in the case of Mexico, it could be so. It's sometimes every morning when we had mass at 7 o'clock, it seems so.
Yeah, I think institutions not always take account of the local needs. So I think in case of the co-production between technoscience and society couldn't be an universal approach. We need to take account of local needs and local problems and local ways of problem solving. So that's why we should evaluate technoscientific projects and societies case by case. Violence couldn't be an abstract concept, but the concrete practices, values, ideas. I think the violence is in technoscientific projects and in societies. So our task is identified by using different kind of tools, not just in private cases, like in private enterprises or societies as a whole, but in specific cases and specific societies. I think art is an important way of manifest problems, take account of the state when state doesn't do anything, or the discourse of the state it's not interested in solving some problems like feminicidios in Mexico City, for example, or disappeared people like Ayotzinapa. It has been 8 years and no one has an answer about it, specifically the state. So art has been an important approach of the problem, not only by painting or sculpture, also in singing and theatrical representations of the violence in women and subjects who are oppressed by the state or by private enterprises or by any other institutions. So I think it's important to take an account the local needs and the local evaluation of projects, situations, institutions, and so on. I think that's my answer.
Astrid, and Dr. Hu said that institution and religion seeks for the greater good. what are our hope in Latin America if institution didn't seem to seek for the greater good of everyone, and the minorities and the women and everything you just explained to us?
I think it's a problem. It's been going around my head. I don't know what is an alternative for these problems do it by institutions. I don't know if nation state is the answer of the kind of institution we need with these social problems and social risks and technological panorama. Como I don't know if the nation state is the way of the political way of give a solution of these problems. I don't know if we are faced a need of rethink another way of organization for our future.
Thank you, Astrid. Esteban, in your case, what do you think? Because there is a strong institution and there is strong challenges. So I know that also in your philosophical work, you're interested in communitarism. So what could you share with us regarding the challenge of institution and what Astrid just said? No, there is not an easy solution. And maybe nation state is not the solution anymore. How do we translate that in the concept of Catholic Church?
Yeah, I would like first by addressing again what Dr. Hu told us just a moment ago. And it's about religious institutions becoming more like, or acting more like, or performing more their commitments as a political institution, and vice versa. And this is a kind of problem. Sorry, but I, as a philosopher, and me studying communitarism, and especially Alasdair MacIntyre's account about tradition, practices, and reasoning. This is part of my studies nowadays. And I would like to say simply that institutions is part of an anthropological development, which we still have to be more concerned in our days. For example, in Mexico, what I can see is that institutions are getting weaker. Institutions become almost invisible in what they present significantly to the society. This is a kind of issue that we should also take in our account about violence, because if institutions which are a midpoint between governments and the basis of society, which are individuals and families and small groups, we are losing what we have as a social goal, as a social end. And of course, I'm speaking now about ethics, because to point a common good is nowadays a very difficult thing. And if violence comes out from a kind of wrong idea of what is better to choose among goods, what is better to do, to choose, to share, it's because we have lost something about our discourse and narratives about the human goods. And this is part of my studies. Alasdair MacIntyre, who is a Scottish philosopher, he's still alive. And his proposal has this kind of addressing more dialogue from both parts in contrasting arguments and these possible differences. In this case, applying this on this violence discourse in Latin America, we could address, I will try this, we could address this in this way. What it is for a government, what is the good that a government pursues or look forward when they are trying to resolve violent conflicts in their population. It can sound simple, but it's not simple, because in every government, you know, we have different parts, different partidos, sorry, and also in families and small groups, we have different, for example, faiths. We can have Protestants, Catholics, and other religions. And what is the good, the more deep good a follower of any religion look for? And when we speak about goods for the humanity or for a social group, that it's a kind of discourse we need to point out when we speak about institutions. And this is a very anthropological approach. What we as human beings in a specific group could name as a common good we need today against violence. It includes also the question about what it is for us an honest research for peace when we ourselves take on hand violent methods sometimes to resolve conflicts, when we still have violent traditions and for example, in some Mexican groups, they still have some kind of violent, as for example, sorry, I'm thinking about this custom and this use in Oaxaca and Guerrero, where small children, girls, are taken as bride when they are just 11 or 12 years old. This is a kind of violence that is a kind of tradition that we still keep in some places. And I agree with Gemma, and you told just a moments ago that local traditions, local issues and problematics need to be listened by these mid-range institutions. Otherwise, we will be lost in what we really are looking for. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esteban. And I really want to thank Dr. Yael Seaman for her comments and leading part of the discussion. And also, I want to thank Gemma, Astrid, and Manuel. I know Yael have to leave because she have to go to a religious and to the synagogue. So thank you so much, Yael. Thank you, Astrid, Gemma, and Manuel. We have a lot of questions and it's what it's all about. Tomorrow we are going to meet and discuss democracy and nation building for Latin America and the Caribbean, between despair and hope. So thank you very much to all of you, and for sharing and everything. So goodbye, thank you.
Thank you very much.